It is possible for any group of people to develop into a cult. The group does not have to be religious to be a cult, because the reason cults form is not primarily religious. Instead, it is a deep mental need for good things. All people want to belong, feel loved, matter to others, and have people who understand you and need you. These are good things that all people want. Please notice that these are all things that you and I should want. We would be evil if we did not want these things. But cults form when people in a group engage in a fantasy that the group has these things, when in reality it does not. Cults begin with the delusional belief that you and your group really support, trust, and love one another. Cults begin in groups that already exist and become worse and worse over time. The formation of a cult is a process. Cults always have a leader who the members consider an authority. Cults do not need to be religious, but they can be greatly advanced by creating their own religious teachings. It is a mistake to assume that cults exist to spread a strange religious doctrine. Rather, they exist because of the deep human need to belong, and their true goal is always to advance their group, not its doctrine. They use religious doctrine as a tool in meeting this more fundamental human need, and they do not take their religious doctrine as seriously as they may appear to. For example, the beliefs of Mormons are easily debunked in 5 minutes with a Bible. But this does not affect the millions of members of this group. In the case of Mormons, the religious doctrine has even undergone sweeping and total changes over the years without losing its membership. But today, Mormons are losing tons of members. The internet has revealed facts that invalidate the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith. But the people leaving Mormonism say that they are leaving because the organization hid the information from them, and not because of the information itself. All of this is because the existence of the cult is not about ideas. It's about a delusional belief that the cult itself is a wonderful family. Cults can form within normal, mainline religious organizations. Later we will look at some of the details of what make a cult. For now, let's take a look at a story where a cult formed in a normal religious group. This cult formed in a college prayer group. This group was part of a larger organization called the International House of Prayer, or IHOP. Slowly it developed into a cult, and eventually it began to obtain new revelations from God. The revelations from God started out simple. The cult leader was just a devoted Christian who had returned from a mission trip to Pakistan. He believed that God told him they would start a revolution on their college campus. The prayer meetings were very emotional and moving. Soon an inner prayer group formed within, with only the most popular members meeting on an extra night. One man said that he went from feeling very included to feeling very excluded when he found out about this. The overall group continued to have prayer experiences that were overwhelming and moving. The leader began to get more and more revelations from God that had no bearing on doctrine, but they were also magical. He claimed to be able to listen in to conversations on the other side of campus. The leader began to see demons with whom they must engage in a spiritual war on campus. Soon, an older married couple was invited to the meetings by a member to educate and teach them on things about prayer. The leader suddenly received a revelation that these people were living in a horrible sexual sin, and that the group suddenly all claimed that they'd been feeling the same thing already. The group increasingly believed that the outside world was a corrupting influence and teaching lies. Group members began to engage in vicious verbal fights with campus atheists and homosexuals. Eventually, everyone in the group was living and eating together and meeting for prayer 3 nights a week. One member was rejected by the group at the leader's request, and so everyone living in the house with him stopped talking to him. The young man began to wonder if there was really something wrong with him, since all of his friends thought so. Soon the group was cutting off all ties with anything outside the group, including family, because the leader said anything that's been going on in your life for a long time is sinful. The group made weekly prophecies that failed to come true, and anyone who pointed this out was labeled a rebellious sinner. Then the group became worse. One woman in the house had her bedroom door removed and her Bible taken because she sinned. This group once determined by prayer that a candy wrapper found in a member's room was evidence of witchcraft. One of the most popular girls in the group had longed to marry the cult leader for years. She was someone who everyone in the group loved. He had always struggled with homosexuality. She believed that God told her she would be able to cure him of it and marry him. She did marry him and was dead 2 months later. The investigation revealed that she had been suffocated by a group member. Many members of the group were homosexual and engaged in orgies with the leader. They had also sexually assaulted this woman, and she had begun therapy sessions. The group feared that she would tell the therapist something incriminating, so they killed her. Please understand that cults do not attract people with mental problems. They attract normal people, although cult leaders can have mental problems. They get worse and worse as time goes on. More on this later, but for now, take a look at the picture. This picture of the cult leader and the woman who married him and died. To recognize a cult, look for these 4 characteristics. 1. Compliance with the group. 2. Dependence on authority. 3. Devalue outsiders. 4. Suppress dissent. Later we'll look at some of the practical ways cults form. For now, we will examine each of these characteristics one at a time as general concepts. 1. Compliance with a group. All groups do this. A group becomes a cult when this is done in a delusional way. A normal group of friends will normally get along. People will agree and do things together. This is compliance, and there's nothing wrong with it. The difference with cults is that the compliance becomes increasingly delusional. The group members begin to ignore obvious facts and reality in order to maintain compliance. This is because of the good desire to belong to a family, and that good desire has essentially overridden an honest view of reality. Dependence on authority. Again, the cult exists because of the need to belong. People who are not unified do not have something to belong to. The cult needs a leader to give it direction and identity. Over time, this leader will become more and more delusional in his or her own leadership. As the cult grows worse, the group will increasingly be more and more compliant with the wishes of the leader, and the leader will become increasingly larger than life. This is due to the delusion of the cult. It is the fantasy that the group is wonderful. Everyone is totally loving and supportive, so the group becomes increasingly incapable of admitting any problems that may exist. Devalue outsiders. The cult must hold up a fantasy that everything is wonderful for its members. Therefore, it must lower the value of those outside the cult. The outsiders' lives must be very bad, or else they would join our group. The delusion of the greater value of the group creates a need for another delusion. It is the idea that anyone outside the group is in some way lesser, worse off, and immoral. This devaluation of outsiders can range from extremes like total hatred of outsiders to simply scoffing at the accomplishments of outsiders, or even the simple belief that outsiders' lives are just not as pleasant. Suppression of dissent. In some form or another, this is the result of compliance in the group. Anyone who raises any dissent in any form, active or verbal, with the wishes of the cult leader is threatening the fantasy of the cultic idea that it is a perfect family. Anyone who dissents will therefore be suppressed in some way. What is confusing about this is that the cult doesn't actually care about the wishes of the cult leader. Rather, the cult cares about the delusion that it is a perfect family. Dissent can be suppressed in many ways. Other members may disagree, disapprove, or shun the dissenter, refuse to talk to them or pay attention to them. Or they may simply just not support the dissenter. Or they may, for example, muddy the waters so that the dissenter's views They agree with them, but they make that the dissenter's views less clear in the process. Thus, the dissent is pretended to have never happened. Now, let's look at the practical stuff. Let's take a look at some more specific examples of how these 4 characteristics may look in real life. And number 1 is love bombing. This is a classic recruitment tactic of cults. The potential recruit can almost do no wrong, and everything he or she does is embraced with enthusiastic interest and attention. The new recruit is led to believe that he or she has found a fantastic group of friends. This obviously can take the form of labeling someone, but in a positive way. Increasingly, you are told that you have this wonderful role to play within this group. This may seem malicious and deceptive, but in reality, the cult itself wants to believe the lie it is telling the recruit. The lie creates for them the delusion of the perfect family. In this fantasy family, everyone is totally in love with each other, trusts one another, and understands one another. In reality, this group of people barely knows the recruit and hasn't built much trust at all. The labels that the recruit is stuck with are probably inaccurate and hastily formed. But everyone in the group really wants to comply with the idea, to continue the fantasy, and the cult has a strong desire to gain recruits in order to support the delusion of what the cult is. 2. Shunning for punishment. This tends to be a clear indicator of cult thinking in a group. This is when the love bombing is turned off and the new recruit is treated more like a member. This person has dissented with the group in some way, disagreed, disapproved of something that the leader said or that the group wants. Now everything the dissenter does is met with boredom or total disinterest. Increasingly, the dissenter will be left out of group activities altogether. 3. Paranoia. The devaluation of outsiders leads to the paranoid delusion that outsiders are actively working against the cult's existence to destroy the cult. They are trying to corrupt or destroy our wonderful group. With this idea already in the group members' minds, any criticism from an outsider is taken to be clear proof that they're trying to get us. In fact, actions of outsiders that merely seem or look suspicious can be taken as proof. In reality, outsiders are often unconcerned with the cult and don't realize what's going on inside it. But in the delusional world of the cult, everyone is foolish and or immoral for being an outsider. To them, their group is the most wonderful thing in the world. Number 4, time control. This is when the cult has a recent recruit, but it can also be for deeply entrenched members. The group increasingly has activities that take up more and more time. Over time, the person loses contact with members outside, with outsiders, with anyone outside the group. Eventually, all the close relationships that the person has are within the cult itself. The cult can come to command control over the economic as well as emotional life of the cult member. These people become the only people in your life. Whenever you need help, they are who you call. Now, please understand that this is normal for any group of people. This isn't necessarily cult behavior. As any group of friends becomes closer, they naturally spend more and more time together. But cults are different. They dominate your time to build the delusion of the perfect family. Remember that no one has to intend to create a cult for it to form. People within the cult comply to the increasing demands of time because they want to believe that their group is close, or closer than it really is. This is not so different from how real friendships form. The difference with cults is that it happens quickly. True, deep friendships take time to form. People have to have disagreements, overcome and forgive when they fail each other, and so much more. But with cults, you avoid all of that hard work. Cults offer a fast track into a complete social world if one is only willing to believe the fantasy. Suddenly you have a world of friends without ever having to deal with any problems. Suddenly you have something to do every weekend. In the cult, the only problem is the person who isn't willing to believe in the delusion of the cult. That's the only problem. The person who's not believing the fantasy. The true motivation for the cult's existence is the fantasy of its own social world that's not as close as it wants to believe it is. So soon after befriending these people, you are very quickly spending all of your time with them. It's essentially fake. But you have this great group of friends now all of a sudden. And all of your older friendships have had their good times as well as their bad times. But this cult group seems to be all good times, at least at first. So you eventually lose all those old friendships, at which point when you actually try to leave the cult, it's going to be very difficult. Number 5, defooing. This is when the cult member is actually encouraged to break ties with outsiders, even family members. This is another clear indicator of a cult. At this point in the video, it should be obvious why the cult does this. We will only add that the ultimate outsider is the apostate. This is someone who was once a cult member and has become an outsider. In extreme cases, this can mean the breakup of families. Since the cult preys on fundamental and good human needs, any normal person can become a cult member. In fact, a person with mental problems will probably be shunned by the cult. He or she will continually damage the fantasy of the perfect family because of his or her mental problems. Number 6, control who is friends with who. Cults are obsessed with recruitment. This leads to the literal assignment of friends. Cults need a very polished front, an image, a social entrance. Members are actually trained at being a good friend. Furthermore, the suppression of dissent and the devaluation of outsiders requires certain people to be shunned and basically defriended. For example, if a cult member is also maintaining strong ties to some other group that's not part of the cult, then the member may either be punished with shunning or else exiled from the group. This can take seemingly more subtle and also less obvious forms. For example, a game could be created that's intended to reach out to people, but it's only to reach out to certain people. 7. Extremely shy people are those who have lost relationships or more susceptible to joining cults. Now, the reasons for this should be obvious, so we won't go into it much. Number 8. Cults introduce dissent. Cult brainwashing is more successful on someone who has never heard anything but one view. If she or he has only heard one way of seeing things for all of his or her life, then the cult can come in and disagree with that one way. This leads to the cult having the image or appearance of thinking for itself and rescuing the person from brainwashing. Isn't that ironic? In reality, people are often only exposed to one idea simply because they never encountered anything else yet. Nevertheless, the cult can be seen as a rescue from brainwashing instead of what it really is. It itself is the brainwashing. Number 9. Demand obedience to petty rules. Now, this is similar to how the army trains soldiers. Cults come up with rules that are not a big deal to follow and often seem almost thought up with the roll of a dice. But over time, this conditions people to obey without question. Now, this may seem sinister or malicious, like intentional brainwashing on the part of the cult leadership. In reality, they do this on purpose, but they are also doing it to build the fantasy of togetherness. This is delusional in nature. It often takes the form of clothing rules, but it can be very random. To the cult member, the point is this. It means the group is unified and together. It builds this false sense of family and supportiveness. People rarely reject these rules since it's never really a big deal to follow them. The rules aren't offensive or difficult or a big deal at all. But the cult members find them important. They substitute group unification under a petty rule in the place of old-fashioned building relationships the old-fashioned way, through working out disagreements, working to rebuild trust after a betrayal, etc., etc. On top of that, failure to obey the petty rules can be greeted with harsh punishment. To the fully engaged cult member, disobedience to the petty rules is a dissent against the delusion of the perfect family and therefore very offensive. Number 10, always have a good mission to bring people in. This point should be obvious. The cult will always have some sort of noble reason for why it exists. And that's really just a great tool for recruiting new members. In reality, the group exists for no other reason than to be a group. Now let's draw some conclusions. First, a firm grip on reality breaks brainwashing. This should be obvious. What you may not know is that a person with a degree in philosophy has a much lower chance of developing mental problems, according to the New York Times. It's the 7th top-rated degree, largely for that reason. If you have actually studied philosophy, then you understand this obsession in philosophy with the pursuit of knowledge and the willingness to ask any question. Now also, please remember 2 Peter 1 tells all Christians to pursue knowledge in an ever-increasing measure, along with all of those 7 virtues that Peter lists there. Now, Jesus taught us to be more concerned with our love for others than the love that others have for us. And this is the most important point I can make. Jesus Christ was going to love people first and foremost, no matter what, even if they did not love him. Cults exist because people are more concerned with being loved than loving others. You see, when Jesus was on the cross, this is the ultimate image of Christian love. Christian love is loving someone who does not love you. That is what Christ did. The entire world rejected him. The entire world rejected God. You see, sin is not a list of rules that, God made up. You're not supposed to do this and not supposed to do that are written down on some piece of paper. Rather, they are the very person of God. In other words, they are who God is. They are just a written description of God's personality, his character, who God is, what God is like. And so when you sin, it's essentially like kicking God straight in the gut and saying, I hate who you are. I don't like you. I don't want to be like you. And so we've all done that. We've all sinned. And yet Jesus Christ, God himself, bore the punishment for the sins we committed. He loved people who didn't love him back. That is the ultimate response to everything that cults are. Cults ultimately are about controlling other people so that you can believe that everyone loves you. And so everyone complies within the group so that they can believe that they have this wonderful group of friends. But Jesus Christ was the loner on the cross who loved the whole world, who cared about everyone. There is no greater virtue than to be like Christ. It should be painfully obvious. When someone says it is the answer, they're right. It is not an answer to a question. It is Jesus Christ is the answer. And so with all of that said, I hope you found this video in some way informative and helpful. Thank you for your time.